We have finished our discussion of the interwar period dealing with Soviet Ukraine, the lands that had formerly been part of the the Russian Empire. And now this next two lectures will be dealing with those lands that up until World War I, until the end of the war, were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the first of those lands were those that were incorporated into the state of Poland. Now, as we have seen in our discussion a couple lectures ago about post-World War I military developments in Central and Eastern Europe, and the settlements reached at the Paris Peace Conference, and then at the Treaty of Riga. Poland was able, between July 1919 and March 1921, as its boundaries were created in this new restored state of Poland. It included large swaths of Ukrainian-inhabited territory within its new state. In fact, in the end, there were approximately 5 million Ukrainians living in Poland. That represented about 14% of Poland's population. So a very large component of Poland's population were Ukrainians. Ukrainian-inhabited territories within Poland included the following listed here: the eastern half of the former Austrian province of Galicia, and then north of that, lands that had been part of the Russian Empire, Western Volhynia, Western Policia, Podlachia, and the Chelm region. Now, because the former eastern half of Galicia had become the basis immediately at the close of the war, it became the basis of the Western Ukrainian National Republic as of November 1918, and because it was not internationally recognized as part of Poland until 1923, it wasn't yet clear to where it should belong in terms of the Allied powers that were responsible for lands in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. Eastern Galicia, therefore, beginning already during this period, continued throughout the interwar period to undergo a development that was in many ways distinct from those other Ukrainian-inhabited lands within Poland to the north of Galicia. Now, this reconstituted state of Poland was a republic. It had a bicameral legislature, an elected House of Deputies, and an elected Senate, so both houses were elected. In terms of administration, centralization was the goal of this new state, and the country was therefore divided into palatinates. It's the same term that was used in the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth up until it was wiped off the map of Europe in the late 19th century, palatinates. And actually, even before Eastern Galicia was internationally recognized as being part of Poland, and again, I'll put that date because it's 1923, but even before that, the Polish authorities, preparing for what they thought was going to happen, and in fact did happen, legal recognition, divided East Galicia, or Galicia, into three of these palatinates: the Lviv, the Stanislaviv, and Ternopil palatinate, named after the major cities in that area. So technically, Galicia ceased to exist. In fact, ever since March 1920, the now non-existent Galicia was referred to in Polish parlance as Małopolska Wschodnia, which means Eastern Little Poland. Now, in terms of its economy, Ukrainian lands within Poland had similarities, but also differed significantly from Ukrainian lands just to the east in neighboring Soviet Ukraine. Eastern Galicia and the other Ukrainian territories to the north in Poland remained primarily agricultural in nature. That is, they were viewed as territories from which to obtain raw materials, in particular food products, and then to supply them to the more industrialized areas of central and western Poland. And the products then would have a market in the east, an internal market. But Poland's economy in general was agrarian in nature. It remained weak and unstable throughout the interwar period. And it was especially hard hit by the world economic crisis of the 1930s. Considering all of this, therefore, in contrast to Soviet Ukraine, there was little hope that the Polish government could make any long-lasting impact in the industrialization or, for that matter, overall improvement of the economy and of the country as a whole, let alone these quote-unquote peripheral areas of the country in the east, these eastern peripheral regions inhabited by Ukrainians. And those in Polish, that whole region was known as the Kresy, the outlying areas, the Kresy. And so by 1939, the end of our period, Eastern Galicia, with over 5 million inhabitants, actually had a mere 44,000 workers in terms of industrial workers, employed in about just over 500 industrial enterprises. As for the northern territories, that is Volhynia and Policia, Podlachia, industrial development there was even less than it was in Eastern Galicia. And so agriculture remained the dominant element in the economy of Poland's Ukrainian-inhabited lands. And not then surprisingly, just like in Soviet Ukraine, so too in Poland was the agrarian question always the most pressing. Poland that had inherited lands from large empires, all of which had large landed estates owned by aristocracy. Didn't make a difference whether it was the Imperial German part of the New Poland or the Imperial Russian part of the New Poland or the Imperial Austro-Hungarian part. And so the Polish Diet, the same House of Deputies, called for agrarian reform. In fact, the land was partitioned. By 1938, end of our period, close to 2 million acres of land were distributed just within the Ukrainian-inhabited areas of eastern Poland. But what's important to note here is that already in 1920, 39% of this land that was being broken up and reapportioned to peasants from the large landed estates For instance, 39% in Volhynia and Policia, those northern lands. It was awarded as political patronage to Polish veterans of war who had just fought for Poland's reconstitution during World War I. While in eastern Galicia, it was redistributed to land-hungry Polish peasants from farther west, who then moved into eastern Galicia. And so, as you can see on this map, the dark shaded area is where ethnic Ukrainians lived, but the very dark areas were solidly now Polish. Now, as for the land itself, holdings by Ukrainians, whether in eastern Galicia and in those northern territories, Volhynian and Policia, remain very small in size. As high as 42% of farms had less than 5 acres, and then another 40% had 5 to 12 acres. So they were small holdings, all of which made surplus production very difficult. This rather dismal state of agriculture in Ukrainian-inhabited lands within Poland was only made tolerable by the remarkable advances of the cooperative movement. We already spoke about the cooperative movement during the second half of the 19th century, still under Austro-Hungarian rule, where peasants got together, pooled their resources, and created agricultural and dairy cooperatives, and also very important credit unions. We know already that on the eve of World War I, still in Austrian Galicia, Habsburg Galicia, the Ukrainians had a total of 609 cooperatives. That number declined slightly because of the destructive impact of World War I. And of course, as we remember, the front was along this line. However, during the 1920s, very sharp turnaround, so that by 1939, so for instance, as I said, there were 609 on the eve of the war. As a result of this sharp turnaround in the 1920s, by the end of our interwar period, there were 3,455 cooperatives. Very large number. And they were spread throughout the entire region. And this is just East Galicia. These cooperatives were united by an umbrella organization known as the Audit Union of Ukrainian Cooperatives. They had, by the end of our period, upwards of 600,000 members. And because of the credit system and ability to make loans, cooperatives were able to make use of modern techniques and machinery in farming. Most important, made available financing and marketing services. All voluntarily, by the way. The most influential of all of these cooperatives was the dairy union, the Maslosouiz. I think I mentioned that last time when we talked about Austrian Galicia. This Maslosouiz continues to exist here in Toronto. It's the direct descendant of it. And if you ever go to your supermarket, as I mentioned before, look for something called Mick Dairy, MC Dairy. Very good products. The MC stands for the Cyrillic MS, Maslosouiz, the butter union. Literally, the butter union. This Maslosouiz, this butter union or dairy union, had just it alone 143 regional dairies an elaborate system of marketing and exporting abroad, as far as England, I might add. It dominated the Polish butter market. So very important were these cooperatives. So aside from what they produced, each of these cooperatives also had its own Ukrainian language publication. There is no doubt that the movement as a whole was inspired by national patriotism. As it approached the nationality question, the cooperative movement and its leaders were aware that political and military action that had been undertaken by Galician Ukrainians during the immediate post-World War I period had been unsuccessful, and in such circumstances, a period of organic growth and a strengthening of the economic base of Ukrainian society was necessary. And that's what they did. There were, however, other elements in Galician Ukrainian society which felt that a political or even a military approach was the more appropriate reaction to their present fate under Polish rule. And what was that fate? Now, Poland had signed international treaties connected with the Paris Peace Conference, also connected with the Treaty of Riga, that was with really Soviet Russia to fix the eastern boundary. Also entered into its constitution, its 1921 constitution, so the international treaties, but the constitution provided guarantees of equality for its national minorities. And Ukrainians were not the only ones living on Polish territory. There were Belarusians also in the east, Lithuanians up in the northeast. There were still some Germans spread through various parts of the western part of the country. Now, these guarantees for national minorities may have been acceptable to a group that had evolved the perception of being a national minority. But Ukrainians, in particular in eastern Galicia, had during the first decades of the 20th century, already under Austrian rule, virtually reached a stage of equality with Poles, certainly in old Habsburg-ruled Austrian Galicia. But then, after the war, they created and fought for the survival of an independent Western Ukrainian state. And aside from all of that, the victorious Allies themselves had not yet become convinced, at least until 1923, that Ukrainians in Galicia were not deserving of some kind of self-rule. And in this situation, the Ukrainians of Poland, most especially those in Galicia, were not about to accept the status of a national minority in what they considered their own homeland. If they did, that would be tantamount to turning back the historical clock. And that, it turns out, is exactly what Poland tried to do. Now, there were some Polish leaders, including the legendary national liberator of Poland, Marshal Józef Piłsudski, Józef Piłsudski, dominant figure well until the mid-1930s. Some of them, including him, had kind of vague ideas about recreating a tripartite federated Polish state. I mean, there was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, really the two parts were Polish Kingdom, the Lithuanian Duchy, Grand Duchy, but now, there was always discussion even then, way back in the 17th and 18th centuries, about a third component, the Rus component. And so Piłsudski thought in these terms: revive a federated Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which would be favorable, or could be favorable, to the Rus component, or the Ukrainians. But that didn't turn out. Restricted to smaller frontiers, the Poles basically then decided to rule over peoples along their eastern borderlands, those Kresy. That included Belarusians and Lithuanians, as I said, as well as Ukrainians. Treat them as minorities living on Polish territory. Minorities on Polish territory. And not surprisingly, many Ukrainian leaders, especially from Galicia, reacted to the new situation as if an ongoing conflict was still in existence. In fact, a kind of underground war was undertaken, especially after 1921, when a civic and military leader, actually the head of the voluntary Sich riflemen that had fought for the Austrians during World War I and then fought in Eastern Ukraine during the revolutionary era, a man named Ievhen Konovalets. Ievhen Konovalets, he established in 1921 something called the Ukrainian Military Organization. The Ukrainian Military Organization, also known by its acronym as UVO. Already during 21 and 22, this organization undertook a campaign that included burning Polish estates, destroying Polish governmental buildings, railroads, telegraph lines, political assassination. There was even an attempt on the head of state, Marshal Piłsudski. Now, these very same years of Polish rule also had a negative impact on Ukrainian national life in Galicia. The Polish administration closed many of the popular Prosvita societies, those Enlightenment societies that we had seen again already founded under Austrian rule before the war, closed their reading rooms, and that action, combined with already the devastation of the war years, produced a marked decrease in the number of these Ukrainian reading rooms. So if in 1914, the last year under Austro-Hungary, there were 2,900 reading rooms, by 1923, the number had declined to only 840 plus. As for the educational system, there was a provincial school administration that existed under Austrian Habsburg rule. It was based in Lviv. The school administration had Ukrainian representation within it, so education was the matter of the local province, in which there was a clear Ukrainian voice under the Austrians, under the Habsburgs. But now it was abolished in 1921. All decisions were from then to be made by the Central Polish Ministry of Education and Religious Denominations, as it was known, in the country's capital, Warsaw. Now, at least initially, the Ukrainian school system, especially at the elementary level, was left intact. initially. But also initially, at the higher levels, Ukrainian education fared much worse. There was always a demand for Ukrainians to have their own university under Austrian rule, Habsburg Galicia. And by the end of the period just before the war, concrete plans were made to open one in 1916. Of course, the war canceled all of that. And now under Polish rule, no thought of a Ukrainian university. In fact, even all of the Ukrainian language university departments, all of them but save one of them, were in 1919 abolished at the University of Lviv. Faced with such a situation, the Ukrainians reacted. They actually founded an illegal university known as the Ukrainian Underground University. It had 3 faculties, at its height 1,500 students, and it functioned from 1921 until 1925, when it was pressured by the Polish authorities to cease operations. Now, by 1923, that key date that we have been mentioning, the diplomatic activity of the Western Ukrainian National Republic's government in exile and the underground sabotage work of the Ukrainian military organization clearly failed to dislodge Polish rule in eastern Galicia. And as a result, Ukrainian political leaders were forced to adapt to the reality of Polish rule. Poles and Poland were not going away. And so from 1923 until the end of our period, the outbreak of World War II in 1939, Ukrainians in Poland adopted 3 approaches to their situation. 3 approaches. And those 3 approaches were: 1, the cooperative movement; 2, political activity, legal political activity; and 3, the military approach. Now, we just discussed the cooperative movement and its enormous success. Let's look briefly at the political and military responses, if you will, to this Ukrainian problem. The political response. By the mid-1920s, several Ukrainian parties had come into existence. Although more of a coalition than a party, the most important political group was something called the Ukrainian National Democratic Union, the Ukrainian National Democratic Union, known by its acronym UNDO. UNDO, this coalition of parties. It called for and favored the idea, clearly, of a future Ukrainian independent state, although in the interim, it hoped to obtain positive changes for Ukrainians living in Poland through legal means. This was not the only Ukrainian political party. There was a Ukrainian Socialist Radical Party. There was a Communist Party of Western Ukraine that existed until it was declared illegal by the Polish authorities in 1924. These and other non-communist Ukrainian political parties participated in either some or all of the elections to the Polish parliament that took place in 1928, 1930, 1935. Again, the strongest party, if you will, was this coalition UNDO, both in the House of Deputies as well as in the Senate. It was an opposition party. which put forth demands to improve the status of Ukrainian schools, and also the reacting to the Polish government's, in turn, reaction to Ukrainian terrorist activity. Now, actually, a school law was passed by the Polish government as early as 1924. And this law, called the Grabski Law, because the prime minister at the time was a man named Władysław Grabski, this 1924 law had a profound impact on Ukrainian schools. Remember, I said the very beginning of the process, the school at the elementary level were more or less the same in terms of number, in terms of language of instructions, as they had been under Habsburg Austria. But now, after 1924, this law put into practice something called the establishment of bilingual Ukrainian-Polish schools. That is, schools in which both languages were taught, some subjects in Ukrainian, some subjects in Polish, bilingual schools. Up until then, they were primarily Ukrainian was the language of instruction. Now you have both. And the result was a rapid decline in the kind of purely Ukrainian language schools from 2,400 at the beginning of our period, 21-22. At the end of our period, there were only 352. So from 2,400 to 352 of schools in which Ukrainian was the language of instruction. At the same time, the number of these bilingual schools reached 2,400, almost 2,500 in Galicia, and another 520 in Western Volhynia. Well, how did the Ukrainians react to this? They did so by establishing private schools, especially at the secondary level. They created a pedagogical society, later called Ridna Shkola, native schools. By 1937-38, the end of our period, 59% of all Ukrainian gymnasia, that is that higher level academic high school, and teachers' college, technical schools, that included about 40% of all Ukrainian students actually were going to privately owned schools, privately run schools, privately operated schools. The status of Ukrainian as a language was also affected negatively by another law, which happened also to be passed in 1924. And that law excluded the Ukrainian language from use in governmental agencies. Under Austrian rule, Habsburg rule, you could go to a local court, official office, whatever, and speak Ukrainian. No, that was now no longer the case. Now, as for the church, Ukrainians in Poland were divided by religious affiliation. In Eastern Galicia, old Austrian Eastern Galicia, the vast majority, almost all Ukrainians were Greek Catholic. Whereas in those northern lands that had formerly been part of the Russian Empire, Western Volhynia, Policia, etc., they were Orthodox. The status of these two churches was radically different. The pastoral and intellectual life of the Greek Catholic Church actually flourished with the appearance of a whole host of theological scholarly journals, the establishment in Lviv of the Greek Catholic Theological Seminary, which then became the Greek Catholic Theological Academy. And finally, the Greek Catholic Church's status remained enhanced throughout this period because it remained under the leadership of Metropolitan Sheptyts'kyi, Andrei Sheptyts'kyi. He had been head of the church ever since 1900 under Austrian rule. He's still around. He happens to be, come from an aristocratic family, raised as a Pole. Part of his family remained Polish, including his brother, who became the Minister of Defense in Poland. So he had good connections within Poland. And he functioned, for all intents and purposes, as the patriarch of the Ukrainian movement, as I said, respected throughout the highest levels of Polish society, and certainly within his Greek Catholic flock that made up the majority of Galician Ukrainians. The Orthodox Church, on the other hand, which ministered to over 2 million Ukrainian adherents in those northern territories, Volhynia, Policia, etc., a less favorable situation than the Greek Catholic Church in Galicia. There was an effort by the Poles to undermine Orthodoxy. So between 1929 and 1930, 111 Orthodox churches were closed. As many as 60 were destroyed. Another 150 remained functioning buildings, but they were transformed into Roman Catholic churches. Roman Catholicism, of course, was the major religion of Poles and the state. Now, considering the unfavorable attitude of the Polish government and faced with the seeming inability of the Ukrainian cooperative movement and the political parties to do anything effective to counteract Polish policy, it's probably not surprising that the third approach of those three that I've mentioned was adopted by some elements of Ukrainian society in Poland, and namely the military approach. The military approach. We've already seen how the Ukrainian military organization, founded already back in the early 20s, continued its policy of underground attacks against Polish governmental buildings and leaders, but its activity was sporadic. And to rectify that problem, leaders felt that the establishment of a more strictly disciplined and certainly ideologically determined organization seemed necessary. And such a movement actually arose among Ukrainian emigre youth and student groups who were living in various parts of Central and Western Europe, because there were many of them who, opposed to Polish rule in Galicia in particular, just left and went and lived in particular Prague, the capital of neighboring Czechoslovakia, but also in Vienna, in Rome, etc. And in fact, at a meeting held in Vienna in 1929, representatives of several emigre organizations founded something called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. The OUN, as it was known by its acronym. This leader of the Ukrainian military organization, Ievhen Konovalets, he now was made head of this new organization. And this new organization soon had branches throughout Ukrainian emigre centers in Western Europe, as well as throughout Galicia and neighboring Ukrainian-inhabited lands in Bukovina and in Transcarpathia. Following in the tradition of its predecessor, UVO, the Ukrainian military organization, the OUN was dedicated to the overthrow of Polish, Romanian, and eventually Soviet rule over Ukrainian territories. The OUN, much more disciplined than its predecessor, and drew its ideological inspiration from a man named Dmytro Dontsov. Dmytro Dontsov. He was not a member of the organization. He was an intellectual sitting in Lviv writing, but quite influential. And he propounded the idea of something called integral nationalism. Kind of a variant of nationalism. Integral nationalism. What did that mean? Well, it meant that the nation, as embodied in an independent state, became the supreme ideal. And to achieve that ideal, it was necessary to possess an aggressive will and be able to act. Preferably, to act under the direction of a strong leader. You can see where all this is coming from. This was quite common in interwar Europe in general. Such views were translated by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists into terroristic activity aimed at achieving Ukrainian independence by overthrowing Polish and eventually Soviet rule. This, of course, was the 1930s, economic hardship because of the world economic crisis, the Depression, starting in the United States in 1929. So a lot of people were out of work, a lot of students had nothing to do. And so this OUN attracted to its ranks a large number of not only Ukrainian students, but also of peasants, peasant youths. OUN's purpose? Quite simple, quite straightforward. To destabilize the situation in Poland until its government would finally collapse. And so, throughout the 1930s, the OUN in Galicia engaged in continual acts of sabotage and political assassinations. Let me stress something here. One talks about the OUN. Clearly, it's a factor. The military solution is important, but it's only one. And in actual fact, most legal Ukrainian political parties and other groups, and in particular, the still prestigious Greek Catholic Metropolitan Andrei Sheptyts'kyi, were openly and publicly opposed and spoke out against and denounced, in particular, the terroristic activities of the OUN. And they, both the cooperative movement and the church, represented the masses of the population. One shouldn't be surprised that the Polish government tried to curb the activity of the OUN. Its first extensive effort in this direction was the so-called pacification program. The pacification program it took place during the fall of 1930, from September through November. Well, what was it? From the standpoint of the Poles, there were potential terrorists at every corner throughout Galicia, and so detachments of Polish soldiers and police went through Ukrainian villages, interning known activists, indiscriminately beating men and women in the process. In fact, the loss of life was minimal, nothing like on the other side of the border in Soviet Ukraine. Nonetheless, this Polish policy of pacification in 1930 and the subsequent arrests of Ukrainian activists, there was even a detention camp set up in 1934. All of this only helped to increase the activity of the OUN and to alienate further Polish and Ukrainian societies. Now, there were some Polish leaders who favored some kind of compromise with the Ukrainians, and there were several efforts made, especially during the second half of the 1930s. But in the end, all of these efforts failed. That, of course, was exactly what the OUN leaders wanted: to discredit the Polish government, and especially those of their own Ukrainians who had favored an evolutionary political or an economic approach, like the cooperatives, to Ukrainians, the status of Ukrainians in Poland. Undermine all of that. In the end, the OUN got what it wanted. Not only destabilization, but the ultimate destruction of Poland. But that came about not because of the OUN's efforts, but because of the outbreak of World War II on September 1st, 1939. And before we get to that, we will be looking at those other Ukrainian lands, Ukrainian-inhabited lands in Romania and in Czechoslovakia, and then segueing into World War II. Have a good rest of the week, and see you next week.